How was London in 1770? A complete historical documentary. Chapter 1. The Mighty Metropolis Awakens. The year was 1770. King George III sat upon the throne of England, and London stood as the undisputed heart of the British Empire. With a population approaching 750,000 souls, this sprawling city on the Thames River represented the largest urban center in all of Europe. To understand London in 1770 is to step into a world both remarkably familiar and profoundly alien to modern sensibilities. As dawn broke over the city each morning, the first sounds that would greet any visitor were the church bells. Hundreds of them rang across the metropolitan landscape, calling the faithful to prayer and marking the passage of time for those who labored in countless trades and occupations. The skyline was dominated by the magnificent dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666 under the masterful direction of Sir Christopher Wren. This architectural marvel stood as a testament to English resilience and ambition. London in 1770 was a city of stark contrasts. The wealthy elite lived in magnificent townhouses in areas like Mayfair and St. James, while the desperately poor crowded into cramped tenements in districts like Whitechapel and St. Giles. Between these extremes existed a growing middle class of merchants, tradesmen, and professionals who were beginning to reshape English society in ways that would become apparent only in the decades to come. The city itself had no defined boundaries in the modern sense. It sprawled outward from the ancient walled city of London, which remained the commercial and financial heart of the empire. Westminster, to the west, housed Parliament and the royal court. Between and around these two centers stretched an ever-expanding maze of streets, alleys, courts, and lanes that would confound any newcomer. Navigation through London required either intimate local knowledge or the services of a guide. Street names were inconsistent, house numbers were rare, and landmarks served as the primary means of finding one's way. A typical address might be given as the third house past the sign of the Golden Lion, on the lane behind the Church of St. Mary Woolnoth. This system, while confusing to outsiders, worked remarkably well for those who knew the city intimately. The River Thames served as the primary artery of London life. Thousands of wherries and boats of every description crossed and traveled along its waters daily. Watermen earned their living ferrying passengers from one bank to the other, often competing aggressively for customers with calls and shouts that echoed across the water. The river also carried the commerce of empire, with ships from every corner of the known world loading and unloading goods at the countless wharves and docks that lined both banks. London Bridge remained the only fixed crossing over the Thames within the city proper, though it had changed dramatically from its medieval form. The old bridge, with its cramped houses and shops, was being replaced by a more modern structure, though the old ways died hard, and many Londoners still remembered when one could live and shop upon the bridge itself. The climate of London in 1770 was notably harsh compared to modern conditions. This period fell within what historians now call the Little Ice Age, and winters could be brutally cold. The Thames itself occasionally froze solid, allowing frost fairs to be held upon the ice, complete with shops, entertainments, and roasting oxen. Summers, while milder, brought their own challenges, including the intensification of the city's ever-present stench. Chapter 2. The Social Order and Daily Existence. Society in 1770, London was rigidly hierarchical, yet surprisingly fluid for those with the wit and determination to advance. At the apex stood the aristocracy, the great lords and ladies whose wealth was measured in land and whose power derived from ancient title and royal favor. Below them came the gentry, those who owned enough property to live without engaging in trade. Then came the vast middle ranks of society, merchants and professionals, whose wealth might exceed that of many gentlemen, but whose social standing remained firmly below. The daily routine of a London gentleman began late by modern standards. Fashionable society rarely stirred before 10 or 11 in the morning, having stayed up late at clubs, assemblies, or private entertainments the night before. A gentleman might spend his morning receiving visitors, reading newspapers, or attending to correspondence. The afternoon would bring visits to coffee houses, walks in the parks, or attendance at Parliament if he held a seat in the Commons or Lords. For the working classes, life began much earlier and ended much later. Apprentices and servants often rose before dawn to begin their duties. A typical workday might stretch from 6 in the morning until 8 or 9 at night, with brief breaks for meals. Sunday was the only guaranteed day of rest, and even then, many employers expected some attendance from their workers. Women's lives were circumscribed by their class and marital status. Wealthy women managed their households, supervised servants, maintained social connections, and raised children according to the standards of their station. Middle-class women often worked alongside their husbands in shops and businesses, while poor women labored in countless occupations from seamstressing to selling goods in the streets. The food of London varied enormously by class. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate meals featuring multiple courses of meat, fish, vegetables, and sweets. French cuisine was fashionable among the elite, and French chefs commanded premium wages in aristocratic households. The middle classes ate well, but simply, with roasted meats, pies, puddings, and plenty of bread forming the basis of their diet. The poor subsisted on whatever they could afford, often little more than bread, cheese, and the occasional bit of meat or fish. Coffee houses served as the great social institutions of London life. These establishments, which had proliferated since the late 17th century, catered to specific clienteles and served as venues for business, politics, literature, and gossip. Lloyd's Coffee House was the center of marine insurance, while others attracted politicians, writers, scientists, or merchants. A man could spend most of his day moving from one coffee house to another, conducting business and maintaining social connections. The gin craze of earlier decades had subsided somewhat by 1770, but alcohol remained central to London life. Alehouses and taverns were everywhere, and drinking was woven into the fabric of daily existence. Workmen expected beer as part of their wages, gentlemen drank wine with meals, and virtually everyone consumed some form of alcohol throughout the day. Water was often unsafe to drink, making small beer the beverage of necessity for many. Medical care in 1770 London ranged from the sophisticated to the deadly. The city's hospitals, including St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, and Guy's, provided care for the poor and training for medical students. Wealthy patients received treatment at home from physicians who might be well-educated and thoughtful practitioners, or charlatans peddling useless remedies. Surgery was brutal, performed without anesthesia, and often resulting in death from shock or infection. Apothecaries sold medicines of varying quality, while quacks hawked miracle cures for every ailment. Chapter 3: Streets, Structures, and the Urban Landscape. The streets of London in 1770 presented an assault on every sense. The visual chaos of signs, buildings, and humanity was matched by the cacophony of sound and the overwhelming variety of smells. Every shop displayed its sign, often a painted board or sculptured figure projecting into the street. These signs had grown so large and numerous that they sometimes blocked light and occasionally fell, injuring pedestrians below. Walking the streets required constant vigilance. The roadways were paved in the central areas, but often poorly maintained. Pedestrians picked their way around piles of refuse, puddles of uncertain origin, and the ever-present horse dung that accumulated faster than it could be removed. The wealthy traveled by sedan chair or private carriage, avoiding direct contact with the streets beneath them. Traffic congestion was already a recognized problem. Narrow medieval streets designed for foot traffic and the occasional cart now had to accommodate carriages, wagons, sedan chairs, and throngs of pedestrians. Contemporary accounts describe hours-long delays to travel distances that could be walked in minutes. The noise of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, combined with the shouts of drivers and the general tumult of urban life, created a constant din that foreigners found overwhelming. The architecture of London reflected its history and the varying fortunes of its inhabitants. The Great Fire of 1666 had destroyed much of the old medieval city, and the rebuilding had created streets of handsome brick houses in the affected areas. St. Paul's Cathedral, completed in 1710, dominated the skyline with its massive dome, while the spires of Wren's other churches punctuated the urban landscape. The West End, where the fashionable and wealthy increasingly chose to live, featured elegant squares surrounded by uniform terraces of townhouses. Grosvenor Square, Berkeley Square, and others represented the cutting edge of urban planning and residential luxury. These houses featured the latest amenities, including purpose-built rooms for entertaining, private gardens, and accommodations for numerous servants. By contrast, the older parts of the city and the poorer districts to the east featured cramped, irregular streets, lined with buildings of varying ages and conditions. Houses leaned against one another, upper stories projecting over narrow lanes to steal whatever light they could. Courts and alleys branched off the main streets, leading to warrens of dwellings where the poor lived in conditions that shocked contemporary observers. The infrastructure of London was primitive by later standards, but represented the best that 18th century technology could provide. Water came from the Thames and from wells, pumped through wooden pipes to those who could afford the connection. Most residents fetched their water from public pumps, or purchased it from water carriers, who hauled it through the streets in barrels. The quality was often poor, and contamination was common. Sanitation remained a perpetual challenge. Night soil men emptied cesspits and privies, carting the contents away to be dumped outside the city or sold as fertilizer. The smell of human and animal waste permeated the city, growing strongest in summer and in the poorer districts where services were less frequent. The Great Stink, that would eventually force the construction of modern sewers, was still decades away, but the foundations of that crisis were already accumulating. Lighting was provided by oil lamps that were supposed to burn throughout the night during the darker months of the year. In practice, the lighting was dim, unreliable, and often absent entirely in poorer areas. The link boys who carried torches to guide pedestrians through dark streets remained essential for anyone venturing out after sunset. The darkness of a London night, broken only by candles in windows and the occasional lamp, would seem almost total to modern eyes accustomed to electric illumination. Chapter 4: Commerce, Trade, and the Engine of Empire. London in 1770 stood at the center of a vast commercial empire that stretched across the globe. The wealth of continents flowed through its markets, warehouses, and counting houses. The city was not merely the capital of a nation, but the hub of an economic network that touched every inhabited continent. The docks and wharves along the Thames handled the physical goods of this trade. Ships arrived daily from the Americas, bearing tobacco from Virginia, sugar from the Caribbean, and timber from the northern colonies. From Asia came tea, silk, porcelain, and spices, transported by the great ships of the East India Company. From Africa came enslaved human beings, though by 1770, the direct slave trade to London had diminished as the triangular trade took most of its victims directly to the colonies. The financial center of this empire was the city of London proper, the square mile of densely packed streets around the Royal Exchange and the Bank of England. Here merchants conducted their business, bankers extended credit, and insurers calculated risks. The Stock Exchange, still an informal gathering of traders in coffee houses and the open air, handled shares in the great trading companies and government debt. Shops lined every major street, offering goods from the mundane to the exotic. The traditional arrangement of trades occupying specific streets was breaking down, but certain areas retained their specialized character. Booksellers clustered around St. Paul's Churchyard, goldsmiths along Cheapside, and fabric merchants in the areas around St. Paul's and Covent Garden. The first department stores were still decades in the future, but some shops were growing larger and offering wider varieties of goods. Markets remained essential to the provisioning of the city. Smithfield handled live cattle, driven into the city on the hoof from the surrounding countryside. Billingsgate sold fish, fresh from the Thames and the coast. Covent Garden dealt in fruits, vegetables, and flowers. These markets operated in chaotic conditions that modern health inspectors would find appalling, yet they fed the population and employed thousands. Manufacturing was transforming, though the full Industrial Revolution was still in its early stages. Traditional crafts continued much as they had for centuries, with masters, journeymen, and apprentices producing goods in small workshops. But new factories were beginning to appear, concentrated particularly in the textile trades. The silk weavers of Spitalfields represented both the old artisan tradition and the new pressures that machinery would soon bring. The service economy was substantial and growing. Lawyers congregated around the Inns of Court, handling everything from property transactions to criminal defenses. Physicians and surgeons served the medical needs of the population. Teachers, tutors, and governesses provided education to those who could afford it. Servants of every description, from skilled butlers and cooks to humble maids and footmen, served the wealthy and maintained their households. Banking and finance were becoming increasingly sophisticated. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, managed the national debt and provided stability to the financial system. Private banks served merchants and the wealthy, extending credit and facilitating transactions. The foundations of modern capitalism were being laid in the counting houses and offices of the city. Chapter 5: Crime, Punishment, and the Darker Depths. London in 1770 was a dangerous place by modern standards. Crime was endemic, policing was minimal, and punishment was savage. The darkness of the streets after nightfall provided cover for thieves, while the crowds of daytime made pickpockets nearly impossible to catch. Violence was common, and murder, while not everyday, was far from rare. There was no professional police force in the modern sense. Unpaid parish constables and watchmen provided what little official presence existed, but their effectiveness was limited. The Bow Street Runners, established by the magistrate Henry Fielding and his brother John, represented an early experiment in professional policing, but they numbered only a handful of men and could not hope to patrol the entire city. The criminal underworld had its own hierarchy and customs. Professional thieves ranged from elegant confidence men who swindled the wealthy to brutal footpads who robbed victims at knife point in dark alleys. Receivers of stolen goods, known as fences, provided markets for purloined merchandise. Prostitution was endemic, with women of all ages selling themselves in specific districts and streets known to all. Newgate Prison stood as the most infamous symbol of the system's brutality. This ancient structure, rebuilt after the Great Fire, held prisoners awaiting trial, debtors who could not pay their creditors, and convicts awaiting punishment. Conditions were horrific by any standard. Prisoners who could pay lived in relative comfort, while those without money suffered from cold, hunger, and disease. Jail fever, a form of typhus spread by lice, periodically swept through the population, sometimes killing judges and lawyers, as well as prisoners. The death penalty applied to over 200 offenses, from murder and treason to relatively minor property crimes. Hangings took place publicly at Tyburn, drawing crowds of thousands who treated the spectacles as entertainment. Condemned prisoners rode in carts from Newgate through the streets, sometimes stopping at taverns along the way. At the gallows, they might deliver speeches, pray with clergy, or simply meet their end in terrified silence. Transportation to the colonies provided an alternative to execution for many offenders. Convicts were shipped to America, where they served terms of indentured labor before gaining their freedom. This system was approaching its end, however, as tensions with the American colonies would soon close this outlet and force the creation of the Australian penal colonies. The courts that administered this system were a mixture of formal procedures and arbitrary power. The Old Bailey, officially the Central Criminal Court, handled the most serious cases. Trials were brief by modern standards, with defendants often unrepresented and evidence presented informally. Juries deliberated quickly, sometimes deciding multiple cases in a single day. Debtors faced a particularly cruel fate under the law of 1770. Those who could not pay their debts could be imprisoned indefinitely, yet prison made it nearly impossible to earn money to satisfy creditors. Families were sometimes imprisoned alongside the debtor, creating a cycle of poverty and imprisonment that could span generations. Chapter 6: Culture, Enlightenment, and the Spirit of the Age. Despite its dangers and discomforts, London in 1770 was also a center of culture, learning, and artistic achievement. The Enlightenment was at its height, and London participated fully in the intellectual ferment of the age. Scientists, philosophers, writers, and artists gathered in the city, exchanging ideas and creating works that would influence generations to come. The theatre flourished in London. Drury Lane and Covent Garden were the official patent theatres, holding royal licenses that gave them exclusive rights to present serious drama. David Garrick, the greatest actor of his age, had only recently retired from Drury Lane, where he had transformed both acting technique and theatre management. Other venues offered entertainments ranging from opera to pantomime to the coarse humor of the minor theatres. Music was everywhere in London. Concerts were held in taverns, pleasure gardens, and private homes. Handel had died only a decade earlier, but his works, particularly the oratorios, remained enormously popular. The Italian opera attracted fashionable audiences to the King's Theatre, while English ballad opera appealed to broader tastes. The visual arts were establishing themselves as respectable pursuits for English practitioners. The Royal Academy of Arts, founded in 1768 under the patronage of King George III, provided training and exhibition opportunities for artists. Sir Joshua Reynolds, its first president, was revolutionizing portrait painting and elevating the social status of artists. Literature flourished in coffeehouses, clubs, and the pages of countless publications. Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer and critic, presided over a circle of writers, artists, and intellectuals that included James Boswell, Oliver Goldsmith, and Edmund Burke. The novel was coming into its own as a literary form, building on the foundations laid by Richardson and Fielding in earlier decades. Scientific inquiry was transforming understanding of the natural world. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, brought together natural philosophers who were uncovering the laws governing the universe. Astronomy, chemistry, botany, and natural history all advanced through the work of members who combined practical observation with theoretical speculation. The pleasure gardens of London provided entertainment for all classes. Vauxhall and Ranelagh offered music, spectacle, and the opportunity to see and be seen. These gardens featured illuminated walks, concert halls, dining facilities, and various amusements. They attracted everyone from aristocrats to apprentices, providing rare spaces where different classes might mingle. Education ranged from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which trained the elite for careers in church and state, to charity schools that provided basic literacy to the children of the poor. Dissenting academies offered alternatives for those excluded from the Anglican establishments, often providing more practical and modern curricula than the ancient universities. Religion remained central to official life, though actual practice varied enormously. The Church of England dominated, with its bishops sitting in the House of Lords, and its doctrines forming the basis of much law and custom. Dissenting Protestants, while tolerated, faced various legal disabilities. Roman Catholics faced harsher restrictions, though these were inconsistently enforced. Jews occupied an ambiguous position, tolerated but not fully accepted. The press was more free in London than almost anywhere else in Europe. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books poured from the printing houses that clustered around Fleet Street and St. Paul's. Political commentary, social satire, and scandalous gossip all found eager audiences. This freedom of expression contributed to the vibrant intellectual culture that made London a center of Enlightenment thought. As the year 1770 drew to a close, London stood at a crossroads of history. The tensions with the American colonies that would soon erupt into revolution were already building. The industrial transformation that would reshape society was beginning in the textile mills of the North. The population continued to grow, straining the city's capacity to house, feed, and govern its inhabitants. Yet for those who lived through it, 1770 was simply the present, with all its familiar routines and challenges. The coffee house regular, the street seller, the aristocrat in her townhouse, and the prisoner in Newgate all experienced their own versions of London life. Their city was a place of tremendous energy and creativity, but also of suffering and injustice. It was, in short, a human place, shaped by human desires and limitations. The London of 1770 would be unrecognizable to modern eyes, yet it was also unmistakably the ancestor of the city that exists today. The financial institutions, the theaters, the museums, and the parks that Londoners enjoy in the 21st century all have their roots in the 18th century city. Understanding how London was in 1770 helps us understand how it became what it is today, and perhaps how all great cities grow and change over time. The story of London in 1770 is ultimately a story of people, millions of them over the years, who lived, worked, loved, and died within its boundaries. Their collective efforts built the city, maintained it, and passed it on to future generations. In studying their lives, we study ourselves, for we are their inheritors, and the world they made is the foundation of our own.